Many people are intimidated by the size of the Bible. We're going to notice a very brief overview of the entire Bible in just a few minutes. And I hope that this will help us to be able to zoom out and see the big picture and have a better understanding of the Bible as a whole. So, we're going to divide the Bible into three major dispensations of time: the patriarchal period, the Mosaic period, and the Christian period. So we begin with the patriarchal period. The word patriarch means father. This was back during the time when God was literally speaking to Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And in Genesis 1 through 3, we read of God creating the first man and woman. And they sinned against God and they needed a Savior. So the very first promise of the coming Savior is in Genesis 3:15. We also read about wicked worship in Genesis chapter 4. Cain's worship was not accepted by God because he did not do it the way God said. Abel's worship was by faith, according to Hebrews 11:4. So we learn that we must worship God the way he said. The global flood of Noah's day is in Genesis 6 through 8, and then the Tower of Babel, and then Abraham in Genesis 12. God made a promise, a threefold promise to Abraham, fulfilled in this order: nation, land, and seed. God would make of Abraham a great nation. He would give his descendants a land flowing with milk and honey, and in that land would be born the seed, that is, the Savior, through whom all families of the earth would be blessed. Yes, it was a prophecy of Jesus. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and he had 12 sons, and those sons and their families became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. And throughout this period, God is telling us man's Savior is coming. Now, the Mosaic period, named after Moses, starts around 1500 BC, and we read about Israel being delivered from Egypt in the book of Exodus. Think of the word exit when you think of the word Exodus, because they were exiting Egypt. The law of Moses was given on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 20. You can read of that. There's also wicked worship recorded in this dispensation of time with Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, 1 through 3. The promised land was actually received in the book of Joshua. Joshua led the people to take the land. And then for about 300 years, there were judges over Israel that you can read about in the book of Judges. And the last judge of all was Samuel. Samuel was the last judge before the first king of Israel, King Saul. After him was King David. After him was King Solomon. Each one of these three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, reigned 40 years each, for a total of 120 years when Israel was united under these kings. But then, after Solomon, the kingdom divided. Rehoboam and Jeroboam in 1 Kings chapter 12, Jeroboam with his departure in worship, and all these things that we read about. Israel would depart from the Lord, and then later Judah would depart from the Lord, and both of them would be conquered, taken off of the promised land to other nations. Israel and Judah were restored to the land as recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. And throughout this Old Testament period of time, God was foretelling that the Savior is coming. Now we go to the Christian period, AD 33 to present. Now, I will say that these dates are not necessarily exact. We're talking about approximate dates, and the actual new covenant was not established until after the death of Christ, Hebrews 9:15 through 17. But in the New Testament scriptures, we do begin reading about Jesus actually coming. So that's the way we're dividing this up right now. Man's Savior finally came, the one who was prophesied in all those Old Testament prophecies, hundreds of prophecies about Jesus. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we read of Jesus' actions on earth. And yes, there's also wicked worship recorded in this dispensation of time. This is something that is a theme throughout the Bible. We must worship God the way He instructed without deviation. Jesus taught about His kingdom, and so did John, and so did the 12, and so did the 70. You've got at least 84 inspired men preaching that the kingdom is at hand and that some of them would see the kingdom come into power before they tasted death. Mark 9:1, Matthew 16:28. Matthew 27 and 28 records Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The Great Commission is recorded in Matthew 28:18 through 20, where Jesus told his disciples to go, teach all nations, baptize them, make them disciples, and teach them to observe all things that Jesus had commanded. The kingdom, or the church of Christ, was established in Acts chapter 2. Some have called this the very hub of the Bible, and many people do not understand the importance of Acts chapter 2 in the grand scheme of the Bible. The history of the early church is recorded in the book of Acts, letters to Christians in the books of Romans through Jude, and Revelation ends with the prophecy of the victorious church. The Savior will return as our judge. We are repeatedly told this in the New Testament. So the Bible warns us to be prepared because Jesus came as the lamb. He's coming back as the lion of the tribe of Judah. I know this has been very quick, but I hope that this gives us a better understanding of the Bible as a whole. And throughout history, God foretold Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection many, many times. This is a big part of the Old Testament scriptures, and now we must obey his death, burial, and resurrection. Romans chapter 6. Someone says, how do we do that? How can I obey the death, burial, and resurrection? I must die to sin. I must be buried in water to wash away my sins, and then I'm raised to walk in new life. That's what Romans 6:1 and following says, and I encourage you to study that. If you have more questions, please contact me. You can study more by visiting my websites, jasonsbibleblog.com and thebibledomain.com.